Good morning. My name is Jerry DiColo, and I'm the Metro editor at the Times-Picayune New Orleans Advocate. Thank you for joining us for this panel discussion on the coronavirus vaccines now being distributed across Louisiana. This morning, we've brought together three experts from the New Orleans medical community to answer questions, dispel misinformation, and offer thoughtful advice to you, our readers and listeners, when it comes to the coronavirus vaccines. This panel wouldn't be possible without our sponsor, LCMC Health. And so before we begin, we'll pause now so that they can offer a short video message.
What does it mean to be wealthy? At LCMC Health, we measure wealth not with commas, but with compassion. Because it's the little extras that truly enrich the lives of our patients.
I'll now introduce Emily Woodruff, health reporter for the Times-Picayune New Orleans Advocate, who will be leading our panel discussion today. Emily?
Hey, Jerry. Hello, everyone, and welcome. Today, we're going to talk about how COVID has affected patients in Louisiana, common myths that our panelists are hearing directly from patients, and mistrust of establishments that have made some people understandably hesitant of vaccines and have a lot of questions about them, particularly the Black and African American population. Coronavirus has hit communities of color the hardest. In the early days of the pandemic, this is something that we were reporting on. For example, sometimes 3 out of 4 hospitalized patients at some hospitals were Black. And these numbers, they're hard to see, but they're not surprising. Disparities are well known in medicine. So, and we're seeing that with the vaccine rollout now. So to talk about it today, we have 3 excellent experts. We have Dr. Keith Ferdinand, cardiologist and professor of clinical medicine at the Tulane University Heart and Vascular Institute. Dr. Ferdinand has a lot of experience focusing on communities of racial and ethnic minorities. So welcome, Dr. Ferdinand. And then we have Dr. Princess. And then we have Dr. Princess Denna, who specializes in internal medicine and pediatrics at LCMC Health and Tulane Medical School, with also a lot of experience bringing care to underserved populations. Welcome, Dr. Denna.
Thank you for having me.
And then we have Dr. Christopher Gillard, who holds a doctorate of pharmacy from Xavier University. He's also a professor at Xavier. He sees patients at University Medical Center. And he's right now doing some really interesting research on how pharmacists can help overcome concerns among vaccine hesitant populations in Louisiana. So welcome, Dr. Gillard.
Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning to you all, and we're going to get into these topics, and we've also asked our audience ahead of time for questions, and we've received a lot of them. People are very curious about this, so we're going to save some time at the end to address those. So first I want to ask you all, not a lot of us have the opportunity to go in hospitals right now, unless you're sick or getting your standard care, you're probably not going to the hospital. So tell us what you have seen with coronavirus just in your daily work. What has your life been like since March? Dr. Ferdinand, we can start with you, perhaps.
Sure. Well, I think this is a serious condition. If you look at the causes of death across the United States, the number one cause of death is heart disease. That's what I am, a cardiologist. About 1,700 people die each day. The second cause of death are all forms of cancer. That's about 1,600 people. So if you take that 1,700 and add 16, you come up with 2,300. We have more people dying from the coronavirus on a daily basis than we do with the combination of people dying on a daily basis from heart disease and cancer. And if this continues, it will be the number one cause of death. Unfortunately, we're going to talk about vaccines, but it's kind of misleading. People think that we're there. I use a sports analogy. We're really not at third base, rounding third base, going home. We're still in the batter's box. We have a long way to go in order to get out of this pandemic.
Yeah. And Dr. Denna, I know you see both adults and children. What are you seeing in your day-to-day? Are people coming in with coronavirus? What has your experience been?
I mean, so I'm seeing in the outpatient setting that a lot of patients are scared, in some sense, to even come into the clinic for not wanting to be exposed. And so as a result of that, we're seeing an exacerbation of some of their chronic medical conditions. And then in the inpatient setting, I see a lot of despair in terms of families not being able to be with their loved ones as they undergo treatment for COVID. So there's a lot of hurt, I believe, in the African American community because the disproportionate number of us who've been affected by COVID. And I appreciate these forums to be able to at least discuss this and to have an open dialogue about it.
Yeah. And Dr. Gillard, I know you round at University Medical Center, and you advise on what kind of medications some coronavirus patients are seeing. I mean, what is it really like in the hospital? What's happening with coronavirus patients?
Yes, my typical role is round as a part of an interdisciplinary medicine team in internal medicine at the hospital. At University Medical Center. And as far as COVID positive patients, I've seen both sides of the spectrum. Mild cases where people have very mild symptoms, they can quarantine and recover at home. And on the other side of the spectrum, moderate to severe cases where people come into the hospital with severe symptoms of respiratory distress or failure, requiring oxygen and mechanical ventilation. And we oversee the drug therapy of those patients on my particular service. And also as part of my research, the community has directly been affected. We have entire families that have been affected by COVID in some way. Many first-degree relatives in one family have been severely ill from COVID. Also, on the economic side, community members have experienced loss of income, employment, and also we've had patients that have lost or had issues getting access to healthcare for their chronic conditions as well too.
Yeah, and I think numbers are still going up, and it's easy to get lost in these numbers as someone who doesn't see these patients every day, but your experiences remind us that these are real people and that this is very much an ongoing concern. So I want to talk about vaccines. You all are in direct patient care, and you hear from people about what they're concerned about. What are you hearing from patients?
Well, one of the concerns that I hear, especially from African American patients, is does the vaccine work in Black patients? And if you look at the trials, although in many of the things we do in diabetes, cholesterol medicines, you don't really have as diverse a population in trials as we would like to have. There was an effort both with the Moderna vaccine, which was the second one released, and the Pfizer BioNTech, which was the first one. There was a real effort to increase minority participation. The African American populations was about 10%. When you add Hispanic, Latinx, Asian Americans, you get to about 25, 30% of the population was minority. I really don't expect that you will have any difference at all, either in terms of safety or efficacy with these vaccines. And when you look at the amount of disability meaning sickness from the coronavirus, I addressed first death, but let's talk about just sickness. About 8 to 10% of people just feel ill for weeks and months. So it doesn't just kill you, it disables you. So I would think regardless of race, ethnicity, social class, sex, gender, or geography, everyone would benefit from seeking the vaccine.
Yeah, and I know, we're still learning about the long-term effects of this and of coronavirus, and especially, heart effects or, things like brain fog, people are still reporting for a long time. So we do know the long-term effects of coronavirus and, that it can really devastate a person's health. So Dr. Denna, I know you've mentioned when we've talked in the past, concerns people have about fertility. Can you address that?
I think one of the major concerns that my patients, particularly the childbearing age, ask is, will this affect my fertility? Would this affect would the vaccine actually go to the fetus? And when you look at the science between messenger RNA, we know that that is not the case. The other concern that I believe patients talk about is what is the long-term complications of the vaccine? You know, it's reasonable to have some fear whenever anything is new. So that is reasonable for that to happen. If we look at the fact that the vaccine has only been out for about 8 to 9 months, right? So we don't know yet the long-term side effects. But if this vaccine functions like any other vaccines, then we don't expect that there will be any long-term side effects. And so, you know, as a pediatrician, one of the things that we do is we give vaccines all the time. And we talk about things to look out for. Some of the common things that to look out for with this vaccination is just really local soreness after getting the vaccine, very mild systemic side effects like low-grade temperature or generalized malaise or body aches and some joint pain. Those have been the common side effects that we've seen. And so, you know, to my childbearing age patients, I tell them that, yes, this is relatively, and I use the word relatively importantly, but this is relatively a new technology for the vaccine, with meaning messenger RNA, but it has been studied very well. And it's been studied on a significant population. If you combine Pfizer and Moderna, over 70,000 people, right? And we haven't seen significant side effects or long-term complications, but that study needs to continue to happen as this vaccine continues to roll out.
Yeah. And you bring up a great point that it's great to have questions, and you should have questions, and don't be afraid to ask them. Dr. Gillard, what are you hearing from your community and your patients about their big concerns?
There have been several things. Some people in the community that we've spoken with in our research indicates there's a little concern about how fast the vaccine actually was developed. So like Dr. Bernard said, messenger RNA vaccines have been around for quite some time. And actually, they're more easily or readily available to be developed. And that's one of the reasons we've developed a COVID-19 vaccine so quick. So that's been one concern. Also, some community members have had concerns about, is the vaccine injecting me with live COVID? And that's not the case as well. Messenger RNA vaccines do not use live vaccines. It basically signals a protein for the body to develop an immune response against it.
Gotcha. Anything else that you've all heard that, you know, maybe we can put to rest for some of our audience members watching?
Well, you know, anytime you have a vaccine that you're using in older persons, 80, 90 years of age, people will die. And sometimes their death may come within a few days or a few weeks or a month or so after the vaccine. And we know on the internet, there'll be these popular cases where they'll say such and such had the vaccine and 2 weeks later, he or she died. And the implication is that the vaccine was the cause of death. Well, let's be realistic. When you look at age itself, it's a risk just being older. When you're in the 80s and the 90s, you have a lot of underlying conditions. And many times these patients will have sudden death. When the person dies suddenly, it's usually from the heart or from a stroke. And that can happen totally unrelated to the vaccine. So we have to be really careful using what we call anecdotes, these little bitty stories where we hear about a person who got the vaccine and then a week later, 2 weeks later, 3 weeks later died. There was even one that was circulating on the internet about in Norway, there were 32 deaths that were seen related to the vaccine. But the follow-up story, which is not as juicy or not as salacious, was that when they looked into those cases, there was no link to the vaccine with those deaths. So we just got to really, really be careful. I agree with Dr. Denard. You never know in medicine. We don't give guarantees. We're simple human beings with simple tools. But if you go way back to the development of the mRNA vaccines, and Dr. Gilliard made this particular point, this has been done for years. We really have not seen in any of the 77,000 people in the trials or since then a direct relationship between getting the vaccine and dying. The stuff that's on the internet are just stories.
Yeah, something you said when we spoke earlier, you said if you gave older people milk and cookies, if you gave them all and followed them, they're just a vulnerable population,
Yeah.
a frail population, and a certain percentage of them will, have a heart attack or die in some way.
Well, we do know that 85% of the people who die from the coronavirus, the COVID-19 is the infection from the coronavirus. 85% of the people are over 65 years of age. So clearly for my patients, it dominates the conversation. I'm trying to talk to them about their heart and their blood pressure medicines and their diabetes, and many of them are asking questions about vaccines. I have gotten to the point, if you look at the publicly available data, that it doesn't make sense for us to risk, if you're an older person, getting coronavirus when we have a vaccine available.
Yeah. And I've also heard some people say, and sometimes I feel like they're joking and sometimes they're not, that it's a tracking tool or there's a chip in the vaccine. Is that something you're all hearing?
I've heard it. I don't think I've heard it a lot, but I've heard that that's out there. There's definitely what I call justifiable mistrust between the medical community and the Black community. Just looking at the history of scientific racism in medicine, and we tend to think about the Tuskegee experiment, but this stems even before that. Right, during slavery, and that really has been part of the justification for it in the first place, right? So that mistrust exists, but I don't want to underscore that a lot of times patients in the community feel, even now, without even knowing the historical context of scientific racism, when they go in to see their physicians. Even now, that there's still issues with access to care. There's still disparate treatment from their medical conditions. And so as a result of that, those kinds of thoughts are their chips in the vaccine that they're going to use to track us with. So those kind of notions do come up, but it's obviously not true, right? So we do need to dispel that myth. The other, I just want to piggyback on the question that you asked earlier. So the other population in terms of questions that I've heard has been those individuals that are immunocompromised as well as pregnant patients. So should they get the vaccine? So a lot of my patients who are childbearing age, they asked, should they get the vaccine? Obviously, during the studies, there were no pregnant patients enrolled. They became pregnant. Some of them became pregnant during the enrollment, but none of them that enrolled. Our recommendation is still to get the vaccine if you are pregnant. Obviously discuss with your OBGYN, so that's obvious. For my immunocompromised patients, I think there's two folds. They asked me this question as well, should they get the vaccine? And so there's two parts to that question, right? So one part is there going to be any side effects, but considering the fact that I'm immunocompromised, right? And so what we see is that with an inflammatory response, and you being immunocompromised, so the inflammatory response might not be as prevalent if you're immunocompromised. So that's one thing to kind of consider. We do see the local reactions, et cetera. But then the other portion is how efficacious will the vaccine be if you're immunocompromised. So that's the other portion to that. So I tell my patients who are immunocompromised, yes, I still want you to get the vaccine, but I also still want you to continue to practice the precautions by wearing your mask, by washing your hands, because, we also have to, we don't know, because there were no immunocompromised patients that were studied. We're looking at that now. Scientists are looking at that now. So we don't know if the vaccine is going to be as efficacious as it could be, dependent upon the severity of your of being immunocompromised.
Yeah, that's a great point. That we're still learning a little bit about it, but we do know it's safe, and we do know the effects of coronavirus, and that there's a risk versus benefit analysis here, and medical professionals recommend the vaccine. And so I want to get into what you mentioned about mistrust, because a lot of these myths and this hesitancy is rooted in a history of mistrust. And Dr. Ferdinand, I know you've mentioned among your older patients, you had told me that you had a practice in the 9th ward long before Katrina, and you've seen this kind of unfold and you've watched history. What are older patients asking you, and what is that history like?
Well, presently, I think the patients are looking for what we call trusted messengers. It's a term of art, meaning someone who has practiced in the Black community for years, either as a doctor, a nurse, or a pharmacist, someone like Dr. Gilliard or Dr. Denard, whom they can trust. It may not even be a medical person. It could be a minister or a priest, or it could be a social activist, someone that has shown bona fide that they're interested in the welfare of the community. And the reason that is so necessary, Dr. Denard said it and she didn't stutter, is because of a history of racism in Orthodox medicine. If you go back to the 1800s, it was the doctors who would go to the slave quarters and practice their surgical arts on the slave women. If you go forward even into the 1900s, there were white hospitals, black hospitals, white wards, black wards. And if you go back to even to present day, many times when I examine patients, they'll say, you're the first person who's touched me or who's looked at my feet. So this is not an indictment. This is historical fact. And we need to have what's called cultural humility, meaning that we need to respect the fears and the concerns of the patients and let them make an individual choice. What I suggest to them is the following. If we don't have the vaccine, we're going to continue to have death and disability. If you do the simple math, 3,000 to 4,000 people dying a day, 3,000 times 30 days is close to 90 to 100,000 people. We're already over 440,000. We're going to have 500,000 people or more in a month are going to die from this thing. So once you give the patients the data that the vaccine appears to be safe and efficacious, it works, you give them the data that the coronavirus has continued to kill, and then we also talked about disability, and you are a trusted messenger. Now, if you're a person that they don't trust, that those data really don't mean much, but you are a trusted messenger, I think that can overcome some of these barriers. But the barriers are real, and they're rooted in true structural racism, the way Orthodox medicine has treated Black patients for centuries.
Yeah, and it's not a paranoia, it's historical, but also you bring up a great point that it's still happening today. I've read studies where, white medical residents agree with statements like Black people aren't as sensitive to pain, and those are very recent studies. And so solutions wise, you bring up these trusted members of the community. And Dr. Gillard, I know you've been doing a lot of research in that. Tell us about your pharmacist-led intervention study.
Sure. Our study has several different arms. And one arm is first to identify the issues or concerns in the African American community as far as vaccine hesitancy. What are their concerns and what would you like to know about vaccination? And like Dr. Ferdinand said, it's very important to meet people where they are, not to make them feel shame for their feelings, but to understand so we can have a dialogue about it. Now, regarding our aim about pharmacists, well, pharmacists are one of the most accessible and readily available pharmacists or healthcare responders that are available in the community, as we think about pharmacists being on almost every street in the community. So often the first line of a healthcare provider for most communities is the pharmacist. So we would like to empower community pharmacists to educate community members about the vaccine and also have a dialogue about their concerns about vaccines, their adverse effects, and also hopefully increase vaccine uptake and acceptance.
And I know in your data, what are you hearing right now as far as who these trusted members of the community are? You're doing surveys, right? You're going out into certain zip codes with an emphasis on Black and African American communities, right?
Yes. So the members of the trusted community, one are faith-based leaders. They are very important in the African American community, what we found. Also, members of community or social organizations have been very important to dialogue with the community and bring back concerns that can be addressed amongst the community. That's one thing we found in our research.
Yeah. And Dr. Denna, I know you were nodding along with a lot of what Dr. Ferdinand was saying. And it sounds like, or it looks like that's something that you see a lot in your practice too, is this deeply rooted mistrust that is carrying over, not just in older patients, but also younger patients, right?
Absolutely. It's interesting that Dr. Ferdinand mentioned because a comment where patients will always say, you are the first physician to actually touch me, to actually examine me. When I give annual physical exams, I remember an incident where I had a teenager just started to cry. And I asked mom, I said, what's going on? She said, no doctor has ever really examined her before, and I was shocked. And this was like a 17-year-old, so those stories are real. And so there's one aspect that we look at, which is access to care. Do they even get the ability to actually see a physician? And then the second aspect is when they see the physician, what actually occurs? What is that dynamic that actually exists with the patient? One of the things that I always say for physicians and patients, there's that power dynamic that definitely exists. There are not enough Black and brown physicians in our community to mimic the community that we serve. And there's a need, obviously, to increase that. But there needs to be, and I think Dr. Ferdinand mentioned this, there needs to be cultural humility in teaching other physicians how to dialogue, communicate, and have that bi-directional communications with the community.
And this just brings to mind all the disparities that we see that led to COVID has really thrown into harsh light the disparities that have been leading up to this moment, that this access to care piece that's playing out right now and may play out with this vaccine rollout as well. So I'm glad we're all here today. You're all here today addressing this. So now we're going to go to audience questions. A lot of these had to do with when can I get it, which is great, right? Like if people want it, it's great news. And I don't think that's more of a question for city, state, federal officials. What do you tell patients about where they should access information about timing and what group they're in?
Well, the first group, as you know, were the healthcare workers and people who lived in long-term living facilities. That was 1A. 1B were persons who were over the age of 70, and it was extended to schools of medicine and nursing. If you go to the Louisiana Department of Health, there's a list of all the various places, and LCMC, Tulane, all the major medical centers will have a site that you can go to and try to register there. Plus, as Dr. Gilliard has mentioned, the pharmacist is perhaps the most common health provider in the community. There are several community pharmacies that are now given the vaccine. What I tell the patients is that you have to work at it. Unfortunately, there's no easy answer. The telephone is often overloaded. The website is difficult to access. Many older persons have a phone that has wireless, but really never use it other than calling the grandkids. They don't use it to go on the internet. So we need to figure out how to get vaccine to the high-risk older populations. Unfortunately, the general population is probably not going to have access to the vaccine. If you're not over 65 or over 70, you're not a healthcare worker, you don't have comorbid conditions, you're just a person in their 30s, 40s, or 50s, and you want to be vaccinated. I'm not sure that's going to be available, I would say, for 2 to 3 months. I do work with the Louisiana Vaccine Commission, and the reason we did not drop down to the 65 age that the CDC recommended last week is because Louisiana didn't have enough vaccines such that if we opened that window from 70, dropped it down to 65, that we'd be able to vaccinate all those persons. So that's one of the barriers, is that we need to get to the states and get to the cities and the counties in Louisiana, the parishes, enough vaccines if you're going to open that window. And that's why Dr. Denard said it, Dr. Gilliard said it, that we still got to do the right stuff. The vaccine is not omnipresent. It's not everywhere. And it's not going to get us out of this pandemic by itself. We still need to do the right things.
Yeah. That's the question I get all the time is, I'm 65, I have diabetes, when can I get it? I can, other states are opening it up. And here there's still demand, in healthcare and 70 plus year olds. So we simply don't have enough vaccine right now for everyone. But hopefully that will change in the coming weeks and months. So moving on to the questions, the first one is how long, if any time at all, would the vaccine aid in antibody protection through breast milk? Dr. Denna, do you have information on that?
So I do, in the sense that, obviously that's currently being studied right now in terms of it with antibodies. We know typically it would be IgA if it is going to be antibodies that will assist, but I don't think we have enough evidence, enough scientific evidence that really supports that. So my recommendation to my breastfeeding moms is that, yes, still get the vaccine, but I still want you to wear the mask when you're breastfeeding your baby. And, I still want you to wash your hands, and I still want you to use the exact same precaution because of the fact that we're still studying all of that.
Yeah. And I think that's, an important thing to say is a lot of questions right now, we still don't have the answers to, and it's being studied. So, okay, next question. After I have taken the second dose and then waited the requisite 2 weeks, can I still be a carrier of the virus?
Again, we're studying it. And sometimes that answer is something that's not sufficient for the general public when doctors and scientists say we're studying it or we're looking into it. But that's the honest way we look at things. We try to find information. Right now, the recommendation is that it's enough to protect you from hospitalization. It's enough to protect you from death. We're not sure that just getting the vaccine is enough to stop you from shedding the virus and infecting someone else. So after the second dose, it takes anywhere from 10 to 14 days before your immune system has built hospitalized or dying from the coronavirus. That's COVID-19. But you still are probably shedding virus if you get infected. The vaccine didn't give you the infection, but if you get infected, so you still should wear your mask, wash your hands, and social distance.
Right. So what we know is that the vaccine appears to prevent symptoms, but we don't really know a lot else. And we also know that some people who got the vaccine did still get sick, right?
Yeah, well, that could happen many different ways. There are 2 shots with the Moderna and the Pfizer. The first shot gives you about a 50% immunity. The second shot gives you anywhere from 94 to 95% immunity. There's a gap. With Pfizer, it's 3 weeks gap between the first and the second shot. With Moderna, it's 4 weeks. Inside that gap, you still can get affected. Or even after the second shot, if you say free at last, thank God Almighty, I'm free at last, you take off your mask, you don't wash your hands, you go to a bar and you just stand around and laugh and joke, you can still get infected within that 10 to 14 days after the second shot. So what we recommend is that even if you had both shots, still wear your mask, social distance, wash your hands, do the right thing.
Yeah, and it's going to be, go ahead.
No, I'm sorry. I also wanted to say it's important that patients don't confuse the side effects from the vaccine from actually getting infected too. So keeping in mind that after the vaccination, you can get some mild inflammatory response. And that's just the side effects. It's an inflammatory process. It's our body telling us that the vaccine is doing its job, which is different from actually getting infected too. So I think patients need to be aware of that as well.
Are the currently approved vaccines safe/approved for use with individuals who have severe allergic reactions to various foods and or medications that require the use of an EpiPen? Dr. Gillard, I know you work a lot with vaccines. What do you say to patients who ask that?
Sure. The CDC actually recommends that people with a history of severe allergic reactions not related to vaccines and injectable medications still get vaccinated. It is highly recommended that patients should consult with their primary care physician before getting vaccinated, but people with history of severe allergies should still get the vaccine. And I also want to add, from the evidence of the studies, the risk of anaphylaxis or hypersensitivity from the vaccines is extremely low. We're talking about maybe 5 cases out of millions of doses of the vaccine given since December.
Yeah, I checked the CDC website this morning, and it looks like about 19 million people have received at least 1 dose. And we just hear about a few reactions here and there. Most seem not serious. A few people get treated in the hospital. Okay, we have another question about sterilization, which we've we've answered. The vaccine does not sterilize people. And this person says, I've seen a couple of people, frontline workers, whose fingertips have turned dark red after getting the vaccine. I've seen responses to that by other healthcare workers that it is also a symptom of COVID-19. What is the correlation? So is that something that you've all heard?
I've heard of it. It's not common at all, and I have not personally seen it in any of my patients. It was first something that the dermatologist picked up. It could be inflammation of the small vessels and the distal parts, the fingertips and the toes. I don't think the vaccine actually can do that. Remember, in medicine, there's something that's called causation, and then there's something that's called a relationship, or something that is related. So you can have something, you could have, for instance, there's a condition called Raynaud's, where your finger and your toes will turn different colors when it gets really cold. You can get vaccinated and then have an episode of Raynaud's. Doesn't mean that the vaccine caused it. So I would be cautious with that causation versus a relationship between two things happening at the same time. In general, the vaccine, as Dr. Gilliard has said, has really not been shown to have any severe reactions. In fact, Dr. Gilliard, I think the number is, in terms of severe anaphylaxis, 11 out of 1 million. So, it's a lottery. And many of those patients really know that they have that type of history. They bring their EpiPens when they come for the vaccine, and they wait a good half hour versus the 15 minutes that's usually recommended. They kind of hang around a little bit, or tell the person who's doing your vaccine, look, I've had really, really bad reactions in the past. I brought my EpiPen. They'll tell you, okay, we're going to give you the vaccine, but we want you to stay for 30 minutes.
Also, I'd like to add as well that as far as the adverse effects associated with the vaccine, the CDC has developed an app called Be Safe, which is a way to report side effects with the COVID vaccine. And also there can be health check-ins available through the CDC. So that website has developed an app to track side effects with the vaccine.
Right, that's a great point that, we're tracking all of this and, getting a lot more information. Okay, with most new medicines, medical professionals assess the effectiveness as well as the side effects of a new product. Is there any medical way to determine long-term issues with receiving this vaccine, since nobody has had it for more than a few months? I know we addressed this a little bit earlier. Dr. Denna, you spoke to this earlier.
Yeah. And so, like I said, anything new is going to cause some trepidation with patients. But to answer the question directly, the medical way to assess the long-term side effects is to have a balance between time and research, right? So with time, we'll be able to study the long-term side effects. Like I said, if this vaccine is similar to the other vaccines in the sense that what are the contraindications, what are the long-term complications, we don't expect that there's going to be any long-term complications, but that has to be studied. I can't underscore enough that time has to be our advocate in helping us to do the study to look for long-term side effects.
What do you say to people then who say, okay, well, I'm going to wait a year to get this? I want to wait.
You're exposing yourself to a serious condition called COVID-19 that kills anywhere from 3,000 to 4,000 persons, that kills 1 out of 895 African Americans, that affects entire families, that causes people to be disabled. It's quite a gamble. And I would suggest, based on the data that we have now, the vaccines work and they're safe. We know this coronavirus is a terrible scourge on our society. It's collapsed our economy. It's affected our ability of our children to go to school. And there's just no way that it makes sense to gamble with your health or your family's health. We're going to have the virus. It's not going to go away. It's something that's going to be part of the landscape. I'm old enough to remember polio, when kids would be out of school for weeks and months and then come back paralyzed on one side. The March of Dimes and Jerry's kids, they make a big deal out of trying to raise money for polio. You don't see it anymore. Why? Because of vaccination. Vaccines have been a wonderful development in medicine. And this particular vaccine, the mRNA vaccines, that platform has done a wonderful job.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point that we don't have so many diseases because of vaccines. And I think we forget about it because people get them when they're children. And, really the only vaccines you get as adults are, maybe the flu vaccine, maybe the shingles vaccine, and now coronavirus.
We all have to do our part to make sure we get to that herd immunity. Whatever that percentage is, whatever that number is, we all have to do our part to make sure we get there so that we can eradicate this virus.
Also, medications and vaccines undergo rigorous clinical study before they're approved and given to humans. And the COVID-19 vaccine is no exception. So we've had rigorous study. Although a new approved vaccine, it's been studied pretty rigorously like other vaccinations as well.
Yeah.
You've had outside panels, Dr. Gilliard, and I think you know that, but for the audience who actually look at the data, the drug company just can't make a vaccine and ship it out to people. The outside panels then advise the FDA and advise the CDC and give the recommendation to give an emergency use authorization use for the vaccines. So there's a process that's not just the drug company, it's not even just the government. They're independent scientists who review these data before you can get an emergency authorization.
Yeah. And I think one thing that goes back to people's concern with the speed of the rollout, how could they do all this so quickly? And, when there's a pandemic, you can move quickly. And a lot of things happened at the same time. So some things that require approval before you get to the next thing with this vaccine were happening all at once because there were so many resources that were available for it, right?
Yes.
Okay, so should you still get the vaccine if you were exposed within a week of the vaccine? What is the recommendation there?
So typically we want to wait if you're exposed. Obviously, we want to wait for at least, I believe the number was 20 to 30 days is typically the recommendation before you get the vaccine. But we still want you to get the vaccine if you've been exposed from COVID. Absolutely.
Okay, and we have another question sort of related to this. This person says, I received my first dose 3 weeks ago, and I'm scheduled to get the second dose this week. I tested positive for the virus yesterday. When can I get the second dose?
Well, similar to what Dr. Denard just said, if you're ill, you should not get the second dose, but it's recommended that you proceed with your immunization if you're not having symptoms and you're stable. The natural immunity that you get from exposure to the coronavirus, we don't know how long that lasts. It may be 3 months, 6 months, but the vaccines appear to be more effective in protecting against severe illness and death from the coronavirus. So therefore, even if a person already has been infected and tested positive, if they're not sick and they're stable, of course, you don't want to vaccinate someone who's sick, but if they're not sick and they're not stable, it's still recommended to get the coronavirus vaccine.
Gotcha.
And as a pediatrician, when we look at vaccinations in terms of giving recommendations when patients are sick in general, so there's relative contraindication and absolute contraindication. So someone who is ill, the relative contraindication, what we state is that obviously when you get better, you come in and get the vaccine. Absolute contraindication depends upon the severity of the disease. So like Dr. Ferdinand said, once you get better, come in and get that vaccination because we don't know the length of natural immunity from the COVID.
Gotcha. And kind of along those lines as well, this person asks, if you had positive results for the virus but didn't feel sick, so an asymptomatic person, are you protected by your own immune system? Should you get the vaccine?
And Dr. Ferdinand just mentioned it. He literally just stated that where we don't know. So we know that as far as we know, about 3 months out, you might have some natural immunity to the virus, and the vaccine is more efficacious in terms of the longevity of immunity to the virus from what we have studied thus far. So, even if you've been infected with coronavirus, we still recommend that you get the vaccination.
Okay. And a lot of people also had questions about, they have specific illnesses. I'm seeing people with autoimmune disease, people with hepatitis C, people with Guillain-Barré syndrome, and they're all asking, should I get it? So, in those situations, is that something where they need to talk to their physician?
Absolutely. I would recommend talking to your physician, but I also want to state that there is no contraindication to the Guillain-Barré syndrome and receiving the vaccination. Obviously, since we have not researched those individuals who are immunocompromised or have autoimmune disease, the data isn't out there. But I will tell you from my experience with patients that I've vaccinated who are also immunocompromised, that they've done fine with the vaccine. And like I mentioned earlier, there's two parts to this. So one is, do they develop side effects after receiving the vaccine? And the second part is, how efficacious is that vaccine in someone depending upon their the severity of their immune system. And so that's the two-part questions for those individuals who have autoimmune disease. But our recommendation is, yes, still get the vaccine. The benefits outweigh the risk. And also, please consult your physician.
My recommendation is the same. I've had several patients who are cancer survivors and asked about getting the vaccine, and my recommendation is to do so. I share the same skepticism that many people in our community have about big government and big pharma. But if you look at the data, you go to cdc.gov, your tax dollars at work. The process has been done. The studies have been done. They have observational data, as Dr. Gilliard has mentioned, where they're actually looking at long-term side effects. And at the present time, we know, and I'm going to go back to this death thing because I think we're undermining it. Anywhere from 22 to 25,000 people get death from influenza every year. In the biggest cases, it's up to like 60,000. This thing has killed 440,000 Americans. This ain't the flu.
Yeah, those numbers are just really sobering, and it's really just incredible to hear that. And, you know, a lot of people have said our way out is this vaccine. And while that's true, you know, I think as you have all mentioned, we still are at sort of the beginning of this. You know, you used some sports analogies earlier, Dr. Ferdinand. But, you know, there's a bit to go. While there is good information here, good news, we must remain vigilant. So is there anything else, you know, you all would like to bring up just from your experience, anything about the vaccines, especially as it pertains to communities of color, anything you would like for people to know?
Well, I think the Tuskegee experiment, which Dr. Denard talked about previously, where you had Black men in Alabama with syphilis, even when penicillin was then found to be effective, it wasn't offered. This is not the Tuskegee experiment. Kismethia Corbett is a young African-American woman who worked with Dr. Fauci in developing the Moderna vaccine. The Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine, although Pfizer is pushed out there, BioNTech is a small company out of Germany. And the two scientists who led the effort were Turkish immigrants. This is multicultural, international, multidimensional men and women who've worked to try to help us survive this pandemic. This is not just the government. It's not just big pharma. These are real scientists who've come up with an answer of how we can deliver these vaccines safely and effectively. This is not Tuskegee. And in fact, if you think about Tuskegee, if you think clearly, it was the penicillin which was withheld once it was found to be effective for treating syphilis. This is not withholding treatment. In fact, the reason Dr. Gilliard and Dr. Denner and myself are doing this, we want to make sure that it's offered to the community, not to withhold therapy, but to offer therapy.
Also, I'd like to comment on the importance of getting the quality information about the vaccine. It's very important to have a dialogue with your healthcare provider. And also, when you encounter concerns about the vaccines, where's the information coming from? Is it valid information? Is it coming from information such as the Centers for Disease Control, which has really good fact-based information as far as vaccination? And also the benefits of vaccination, as I tell my patients, I advise my patients as I advise my family. So it's no blurred lines there. So I cannot express the benefit of vaccination during this pandemic.
And I kind of want to piggyback what Dr. Gillard and Dr. Ferdinand said. So those individuals who have physicians that they trust and have developed relationships with, please talk to your physician. Let them answer some of these questions. Don't be afraid to ask questions. So I want to empower you to do that. So that's one thing. Those individuals who don't have physicians, use your community as resources. I understand not everybody will have the internet to be able to look up some of these facts, but there are trusted community members, pharmacists that are in the community, faith-based leaders that are in the community, health organizations that are in the community that are offering information like this to you all, to be able to empower you to make these decisions. Remember that this vaccine is being given to everyone, right? So this vaccine isn't just being isolated and given just to the Black community. It is being given to everyone. And so we all have a responsibility, to do what we can to eradicate this virus. We know if the virus continue to replicate and populate, then we are going to get mutations, right? And we're going to be having a different conversation besides the ones that we have now. So we all have a job to do once this becomes available to a wider array of patients. Then we all need to make sure that we're doing our part.
One last thing that I would like to mention, for decades, we've had the Healthy Heart Community Prevention Project. It's my nonprofit. It's led by my wife, Dr. Daphne Ferdinand. And we would go to churches and sporting events and do blood pressures and cholesterol screenings and teach about diabetes. I have now added to my lectures and my presentations many times on Zoom, since we can't have congregations come together. Get the vaccine, learn about coronavirus. So now Healthy Heart is not just get your blood pressure checked, get your cholesterol checked, get your blood sugar checked, but learn about the vaccine and get the vaccine. If you are in that population where it's available, get the vaccine. That then becomes part of the message. Why? Because it's all about having a more healthy, functional, stable community. And whether you're dying from a heart attack or stroke or dying from coronavirus, it's still death and disability.
Yeah, we talk about herd immunity a lot, and we need everyone to participate in order to get there and to truly be protected. And there are reasons for this mistrust, but I think you all have done your part as community leaders, people that we all look up to, and helping to alleviate that. So thank you all so much for joining us. We just so appreciate you sharing these facts. Thank you all.
Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you.
Thank you.